Jason, welcome.
Thank you, Randy. Chairman. And for those of you that are not familiar with me, I'm Jason Phillips, Deputy Regional Director, Mid-Pacific Region at Reclamation. And I've worn a few hats at Reclamation. Before this, I managed the Klamath Project for 3 years. Previous to that, I was the program manager for the San Joaquin River Restoration Program. And then before that, I spent some time as Reclamation's program manager on the CalFed Bay Delta program. And then the first job I had with the Bureau of Reclamation starting in 2001 was to initiate the feasibility study on the Upper San Joaquin storage investigation. So way back then, I did have several experiences presenting to CalFed and then subsequent to that the Bay Delta Authority, at least on the Upper San Joaquin storage and occasionally on all the storage program. A lot of things have changed since then, except for I think I'm still the youngest person in the room. So, but what I was going to do today was just provide a brief update on where we are, our Reclamation, and our partners relative to getting to some key decision points. And I think what I was reading in the paper about what I was to address was what's it going to take to get these projects implemented. And I'd like to talk more about that, but I think the key that we are facing relative to future is the decision point on whether we're going to implement anything relative to surface storage. The way in which that decision is made is going to significantly drive how these projects and when these projects are implemented. So I was going to focus on my thoughts on decision points and where we are in that process to get there.
Jason, as a neophyte to this whole process, could you start out by talking about comparing the underground storage versus surface storage, the advantages, disadvantages of each? You're an expert in this field, aren't you?
I am not an expert in comparing the underground versus surface storage. And I think that I could have some opinion on that. I think that there's pros and cons to both. I think one thing we have found, and at least that I've seen in the last 10, 15 years, is there are less challenges politically necessarily as it relates to implementing groundwater storage type projects. They are important to pursue, important to continue to pursue. And whether or not they would take care of the needs of the system, that being the groundwater project, would be something that we all probably have different opinions on based on the analysis that's out there. I was around in 97 and 2000 and in the 2000s when there was very wet years, and I would say that there was a lot of water that was not captured, could not be captured by groundwater storage. Whether or not that's important water to capture for the system is subject to different value judgments, I think. But
it seems, just from a common sense standpoint, that if this El Nino is in fact going to develop, if this part of California gets as much rain as the southern part, then it would be really important to capture as much of that as possible. And it would seem to make sense if there is a lot of porous rock around, like if we could divert some of this thing, and rather than lose all this fresh water into the ocean, to divert some of it into floodplains, and I presume that floodplains are good aquifers, that the rock is porous enough. And I'm also assuming that we can probably bring to the surface at least 50% of the water that goes down, and that's an answer, an issue I'd like to hear some discussion about. But if all is true, it seems like a no-brainer. Rather than build and try to flow, if we can just use this naturally to divert and capture these waters that are otherwise being lost to the ocean in aquifers and retrieve them just by digging wells and pumping them to the surface, why not?
I am not going to disagree with that. I'm also not going to advocate for surface storage here today. It's probably not a good role for an agency of the federal government to do one or the other, but I do feel like it is our charge and responsibility to lay out, like we are trying to do, the technical aspects of what constructing surface storage would look like, what the effects would be, what the costs would be, and then the administration, Congress, and local sponsors are really going to need to decide whether that is an additional component to the system that's needed. As a matter of policy within reclamation, I would agree 100%. And we have, with what you have brought up, which is there are a lot of tools to solve the needs of the water community, and one of those is recycling and demand reduction and groundwater storage and conjunctive use of water. And reclamation, I believe, to the extent we can with budget limitations, has stepped up to help finance and partner on as many of those as possible. I would venture to say that those types of projects will continue to the extent that they're feasible for the local entities that need that water, and you know, I would expect that we would project that those types of tools will continue to be fully utilized. So really, we're not necessarily judging whether or not we should do one or the other. We already know that where it makes sense to reduce demand or recycle water or conjunctively use it, we should do that. The question really is, in addition to that, is additional storage, surface storage, a necessary component or not of the system? And really, as a more technical matter, we are tearing off of the CalFed Record of Decision in 2000, which made the decision that in addition to those other things, we should look at and determine the feasibility of surface storage.
Regarding surface storage, Jason, I read someplace that there's an awful lot of sediment that's built up in the reservoirs, and that, and I'm hearing a negative reaction over there. And I've read as much as 20% of the volume of sediment. That if you could, rather than raise the barriers to keep the water, lower the bottom, that it would be a fairly inexpensive way to increase the storage, assuming there's water to be stored.
Jason, let me suggest that we defer that question to Dr. Lund, and you go ahead and make your presentation. And after the three panelists have completed their presentations,
Dr. Lund has a view on that.
I will defer to your judgment on that, Chairman, and I will move forward.
You'll accept that, okay.
And I'll keep quiet, Jason.
Whatever works for the council. So in terms of decision points, generally speaking, I'll speak to the federal decision making. I'm not going to get into the gory details for several reasons, but just generally speaking, what it means to get to a decision point on something like new surface storage for us is, it's pretty simple. It's to complete a feasibility study. And there are lots of procedures and guidelines on how the federal agencies are to go about putting together a feasibility report, and how we are to do our calculations, how we are to look at cost estimating, alternatives analysis. All of that is spelled out in quite a bit of detail for us. But another component of getting to a decision point is environmental impact statement, so that we have adequately disclosed the effects that such a decision might have, and that the public has an opportunity to tell us how good or bad it would be. And then we have an opportunity to address those effects. So those are really the two key components before we can get to a decision point, and I'm speaking for the federal government. And then once we get to that point, which I'll in a second tell you how close we are to that, we really then seek guidance from the administration through Interior and also the Office of Management and Budget to take a position on whether or not the decision would be to support or not moving forward with construction of a project. So that's pretty well defined, but the decision point is more than that. It involves non-federal decision making, and I think that's a different process. It can use the same information, but there are it's necessary to have non-federal entities, could be state agencies, local, or both, make decisions also on whether or not to move forward to surface storage, and that may require things such as an environmental impact report, for example. Probably would. There's also the possibility that additional analysis might be required, more or different than what was necessary for the federal government to make a decision. It might even be necessary to modify some of the alternatives that were looked at. And as we're getting close, as the federal government process is getting close to making a decision, there have been some challenges getting to a point where we think any non-federal entity is ready to make a decision. And I can just tell you that it will be critical that that there's a strong position from non-federal entities on this relative to moving forward with implementation. If there are not, then the federal government is not going into this alone by any means. So the schedules that I'm going to give a quick update on is going to be relative to those decision points. We have charts of probably 100 different milestones that I'm not going to go over, but they all relate to getting to these points where we can make decisions. In terms of enlarging Shasta Reservoir, we already have submitted publicly a draft feasibility study and a draft environmental impact statement, and that process has, for the EIS, has already gone through public comment period, and we're already addressing those. And right now we have on our schedule that we are on right now is by December of 2014 we would have a final environmental impact statement and feasibility study. So from the federal standpoint, that puts us in a position to say we're ready to make a decision, at least start to tee that up within the administration. The other project that I would address is the Upper San Joaquin storage. That would be Temperance Flat is the alternative we're looking at.
Randy, can I? Yes. So could you, in each of these, starting with Shasta, indicate where you are in partnerships and whether they apply or don't apply?
And I think the thoughtfulness of the chairman in terms of how these panels are put together, what I would defer that to is the partners themselves. And I think there's,
yeah, I didn't need a whole discussion, but so was Shasta built with federal money?
Yes.
Alone?
That's my understanding.
Would expanding it be built with federal money alone?
Currently, California legislation prohibits the state of California from participating in construction costs. They can contribute to study costs, but there is a legislative prohibition for the state to be involved in enlarging Shasta at this point in time.
So the federal government is proceeding with studies on the expectation that the federal government will finance construction costs to enlarge Shasta if it is done. Is that correct?
We have that is the context in which the study is being completed, with the understanding, like the current federal investment, it would be repaid by a non-federal entity, that the beneficiaries. And we have been in discussions for more than a decade with the state of California and with Central Valley Project districts about that. Now, have we made progress to where we know how that would happen? No, we haven't. But that's why I'm highlighting right now the how near we are from a federal standpoint to getting to where the non-federal entities, probably folks that you represent including, will need to make a decision as to whether we're going to move forward with surface storage in the state or not. I mean, federal government, like I said, we're not going to advocate for this. It's a tool that the multi-agency groups over the past 20 years have said we need to look at. And so I think we're getting finally to a point where those decisions will be made. On Upper San Joaquin, which is Temperance Flat, we're at a point where we have submitted a draft feasibility report publicly. We're nearing a point to have an environmental impact statement provided to the public for that review period for our NEPA compliance. August of 2014 is when that is scheduled. And then both of those are scheduled to be final by July of 2015 is the current schedule. And then that would be ready from a federal standpoint for a decision point. The other project that's on the list from the council in terms of tracking to get completed is Sites Reservoir north of Delta Off-Stream Storage. That's from a federal perspective in a little bit of a holding pattern right now. I think it would be best to wait for Thad Bentner who's representing the local JPA to talk about that. And if I'll still be here if there's any questions related to that for reclamation. So the question, I guess, would be, well, then what? You're going to have these feasibility reports, and I'll tell you, there's been the pressure reclamation is getting, at least my boss and myself and the commissioner, our pressure is to get these done, and that's our priority. We have not been getting pressure to not do them. We have not been getting pressure to do them any differently. For the most part, it's been get them done so that we can have the right discussion to finish, either make a decision, we're going to move forward or not. But so what's going to happen once we have the feasibility reports? Well, it's looking as if from a federal, the way we do our calculations, which will be different from other people, they're looking like, at least for the Shasta and the San Joaquin, that we would call them feasible projects. That does not mean a decision would be made to implement them. It means they would be considered feasible projects. And I'm not going to judge the fact that it could change between the draft and the final too, with the input and the reviews of others. But there's a need to have non-federal decisions coming in at the same time. If there is not a non-federal decision for go or no go, I would highly doubt that the federal government will even make a decision. They'll be in a holding pattern until that's figured out.
May I summarize this as saying that the feds don't mind spending money studying all of these things, but unless there are other financial participants who will pay all or substantially all of the cost, you're not going ahead on your own? And I don't think that's an unfair position, but, isn't that really the question on financing?
Well, the administration has budgeted for, and Congress has been appropriating funds for the studies and directing us to get them done, so I would agree with that. And then, but in terms of moving forward to the next phase where Congress would have to authorize a federal agency, presumably reclamation, to move forward with surface storage, I would doubt that is going to happen without full support from the right decision-making groups that are non-federal to be partners. And now how that cost share would happen.
Yeah, well, you're agnostic on how other people pay the cost of developing the facility.
Well, reclamation is
that.
right.
Yeah, okay. Does the administration favor constructing at federal expense Shasta or San Joaquin or the north of Delta? Not Congress, but the administration.
Right. Yeah, the administration is not in a position to comment on that at this point. That would be.
Well, that's what I thought. Here's the thing on these big issues. These have been around as discussion items on the public agenda for over a decade, probably 15 years. I can't think of a single local participant who has offered to pay money, except in the abstract term, we'll pay our fair share, which generally is interpreted $1 local, $95 somebody else. At what point does the federal government just call an end to the discussion because no one's prepared to step up and finance it?
I think it would be at these decision points. I think these are significant milestones.
Is it fair to say that none of these options offer any immediate relief to the current drought California faces?
That would depend to the current drought, correct. Unless it extends for several
Yeah, I noticed the time to construct is 5 years, 8 years, and 10 to 13 years, depending on which facility we're talking about.
But immediate is certainly relative. If in 2001 we would have just decided to construct Temperance Flat, we would capture the 2015 storm.
Okay, thank you.
And then I guess I would just conclude by saying that, and I've mentioned it already once, but different people are going to see feasibility differently. I'm sure we're going to hear one of the panel members, who I see has generously marked up the fact sheet that I sent out, will have views on feasibility, and that's good, that's healthy, and it's expected, right? Different groups are going to have different ways that they look at whether a project is feasible. Our task, and what I would expect people to do relative to analyzing what we've done, is, did you follow the guidelines and the principles that you as a federal agency are required to, or not? Because we're not trying to, it's not our job to try and make something appear feasible or not. It's, here is the formulas to use them, here's the process, follow it, and then the outcome is what it is. As a local entity, as an economist representing a state agency or whatever, there would be different ways in which feasibility of a project is determined, and that's healthy, and that's good. So as we look at what different ways are, we want to see feasibility, whether there's different analyses or different alternatives, I would say we would be open to doing that as long as it's really focused on a decision maker needing to see that. If somebody that's a decision maker says, well, reclamation, we can't make a decision based on what we see, but if you analyze excavating 200 million cubic yards of material out of Shasta and show me that that's not better, then I can make a decision. That's a perfectly reasonable thing that we should do.
Jason, just to be clear, on the feasibility study, was that a physical feasibility that, you can get the equipment up there, you can move the soil, you can prepare the space, or was it an economic feasibility as well? Economic in the sense that somebody's got to pay for it, and that it is feasible if money comes from this organization or that organization or whatever. Did you get involved in that?
So there's three ways, and there's technical, it did look at that. Mm-hmm. There's economic, and it does include that. And then there's financial feasibility, which is there an ability to pay? And that one I would have to get back to you on to see how far we got in that in the process.
But the impression I have now is that the federal government is not going to put money there unless there's local quote-unquote participation. And I think our chairman said that there's no way that the state can participate in this if it's a federally funded dam in the beginning.
Well, local participation could be a water district signing a long-term contract to repay the cost. Okay. And then federal money could be used up front then the cost. That would be current policy, current
Good.
Law.
And the economic feasibility says this makes sense in terms of the price of water and the cost going into it, that there is a payback.
The benefits exceed the costs.
A monetary payback.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Jason, thank you very much. And I want to publicly thank you for all the assistance you provided on a different matter from the Bureau, from the Department, our work towards implementing the Implementation Committee meeting. You were most helpful, and we thank you for that. Thank you for the report today. We're encouraged that there is a goal line now for these processes. That's encouraging news, so thank you. And now, AJ, from the state.
Red button down.